We're going to mute you. You don't.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for bringing the gavel. We'll allow for a moment while the good ranking member distributes treats. Welcome everyone this afternoon as we move back and forth in the weather. We're conducting our own little polls up here. I think we prefer warmth to frigid temperatures, but it's a little toasty in here. So I welcome everyone to this forum on two really substantive reports that the Office of Fiscal Analysis and the Department of Revenue Services have produced for us. And I just want to start as an introduction that both of these reports took a tremendous amount of work. First up is the Office of Fiscal Analysis, which we are extremely fortunate to have in Connecticut, a nonpartisan group that does the caliber of analysis that this group does. And I know this took a tremendous amount of work to put together. And I just want to extend the same. I know that DRS also does a tremendous amount to produce the incidence reports and others, and has worked collaboratively with the legislature in order to refine and enhance those reports going forward. And so I thank both presenters today for everything that's gone into those reports. And with that, I will, any comments from my committee leadership?
Let's go.
Let's go. I hand the gavel to the Office of Fiscal Analysis. Welcome.
Good afternoon. I'm Neil Ayers with the Office of Fiscal Analysis. We're your nonpartisan fiscal office, and we are tasked in statute to produce every 2 years the tax expenditure report. Before I turn it over to the people who know the stuff inside now, I just want to say thank you to Michael and the analysts that are involved with this. It's a pretty heavy lift every other year. It actually comes right on the heels of the fiscal accountability report. Can ruin some folks' holidays, but they do a lot of work and we really appreciate it. And I will turn this over to Michael Murphy.
Thank you, Neil. Good afternoon. The biennial tax expenditure report is a list of enacted policies, nearly 200 pages in length and covering well over 300 distinct state and municipal tax expenditures. The broad scope and complexity of the report are potentially overwhelming. With that in mind, we prepared a primer to introduce key concepts. We will then touch on summary fiscal information, highlight the major pieces of each category of tax expenditure, and try to answer any questions you may have. Please keep in mind that we are your fiscal staff and available to respond to questions you may have today or in the future about this lengthy report. Before I begin, I wish to thank the analysts responsible for preparing the work. Evelyn Wisniewski is responsible for the estimates in the sales and health provider tax categories. The sales tax category all by itself makes up about half of this report. There's quite a bit of work by her. We also have Patrick Mellon, who does our estimates related to transportation and fuel. Lauren Goulet, our new municipal analyst. Then we have our dynamic duo of income tax, Mr. Bill Letterman and Mr. Christopher Wetzel. Chris Wetzel also handles the business corporation tax estimates and every other tax estimate in this report. I want to especially thank Evelyn for taking charge of compiling and organizing the document, this 200-page report, and preparing these slides. Here's the statutory basis for the tax expenditure report. For each tax expenditure, we must provide a description, historical information, including the year in which the expenditure was enacted, the purpose of the expenditure, estimates of the fiscal impact and potential revenue gain from repeal, and finally, an estimate of the number of taxpayers benefiting from the expenditure. What is a tax expenditure? A tax expenditure is a policy which foregoes revenue that otherwise would be collected. The goal of the policy may be to encourage certain activity or to limit the tax burden on certain taxpayers. One example would be to encourage economic development by providing financial assistance to businesses through corporation tax credits. Tax expenditures may be enacted for a variety of reasons and benefit a very many or very few taxpayers. Unless a sunset date is provided in statute, tax expenditures are permanent. Tax expenditures may be implemented through exemptions, credits, or deductions. An exemption excludes specified transactions from a tax. An example here is the food products exemption from the sales and use tax. A credit directly reduces a taxpayer's tax liability. Property tax credit against the income tax is an example here. Deductions reduce a taxpayer's taxable income by the amount of a specific transaction. An example here is the check contribution deduction impacting the income tax. There are several different possible rationales for tax expenditures, starting at the upper left, perceived equity. These tax expenditures are enacted to remedy a perceived unfairness in tax burden. For instance, reducing taxes on the consumption of necessities because the tax burden is viewed as excessive relative to the income of low-income or disadvantaged persons. Specific examples of this include sales tax exemptions on food, clothing, and medicine. Efficiency. The cost of adequately collecting and administering the tax is high relative to the potential revenue that could be gained from taxation. Incentive. The goal is to encourage certain desirable activities related to economic growth and development, charitable or nonprofit work, or conservation of resources, Specific examples include Connecticut business tax credits for expenditures on research and development, hiring displaced workers, donations of open space land, or rehabilitation of historic homes. Redundancy. A taxable good or service is included in the base of one tax, but excluded from the base of another to avoid overtaxation. For example, sales of gasoline are subject to the motor fuels tax, excise tax, and thus exempt from the sales tax. Cascading. This occurs when a tax is imposed on a good or service at more than one stage of the production process, so that the total tax incorporated into the final price of the good or service is greater than the legislated tax rate. Examples of this tax expenditure include sales tax exemptions for business inputs like raw materials, machinery, and equipment. Clarification. This type of tax expenditure clarifies the definition of what is taxable. An example here is the sales tax exemption for property tax payments under motor vehicle leases, which clarifies that the tax is levied only on the portion of the lease payment that covers the use of the motor vehicle. Conformity. This type of tax expenditure conforms statute to federal law or a general policy of taxation adopted by the state. For instance, the state has chosen not to tax itself and by extension its political subdivisions. Expediency. Expenditures of this type may violate one or more principles of a high-quality revenue system without any apparent counterbalancing or compensating precept. That's a little abstract. Another way of putting it would be that this category could also be described as a catch-all for any tax expenditure that doesn't fit neatly into one or more of the preceding categories. Application of these 8 labels may be subjective, and in some circumstances, more than one label may apply. We use several sources to provide estimates for the report. Key sources include annual reports from the Connecticut State Department of Revenue Services and Economic and Community Development. Additionally, several other resources are used to develop relevant information. In some cases, data are unavailable or too indirect, and thus an estimate cannot be determined. There are 2 good reasons to use caution when referencing estimates in the report. First, estimates may have been updated. As an example, income tax data from calendar year 2022 has recently been finalized, and we will be updating some estimates accordingly in the coming weeks. Second, estimates in the report are standalone, assuming all other policies remain unchanged. This can pose an estimation problem in the context of a budget plan or a tax package. If that tax package or budget plan includes other changes to the tax code that may alter the underlying tax base, for example. The simple solution to both these potential problems is to reach out to our office to check that the estimates you are using are up to date and do not interact unexpectedly with other proposed tax changes in your budget plan or tax package. Now on to the numbers. Here's a summary table of state tax expenditure totals by tax type. The bottom line total estimated amount of state tax expenditures is approximately $10 billion this fiscal year. Within the personal income tax, exemptions for Social Security benefits, income from pensions and annuities, and income from individual retirement accounts is $316.2 million in total, or 40% of this category. Another 45% of this category is attributable specifically to credits against the personal income tax, which we will highlight in the next slide. At approximately $5.4 billion, just over 1/2 of the total amount of tax expenditures impacts the sales and use tax. More details on this total are provided in upcoming slides. Within the corporation and insurance taxes category, the largest single item, which is estimated at $190 million, is the deduction for net operating carry forward losses. Several tax credits, which we will discuss in the next slide, make up most of the rest of the 553.7 million total in this category. The single largest amount in the petroleum company's gross earnings tax or PGIT category is an exemption for the first sale of diesel fuel. This exemption is relatively technical in nature. When it was enacted in 2007, the exemption came with a corresponding increase in the motor fuels rate for diesel that essentially accounts for a PGIT component within that tax, within motor fuels. The estimated amount of this tax expenditure is $283.6 million. The second largest tax expenditure in this category is the exemption for number 2 heating oil used for heating purposes. The estimated amount is $181.7 million. The third largest tax expenditure in this category is the exemption for propane used for residential heating, which is estimated at $29.4 million. Together, these three tax expenditures make up approximately 90% of the total for the PGIT category. In the motor fuels and motor carrier road taxes category, by far the largest single tax expenditure relates to fuel distributors. This tax expenditure, which is estimated at roughly $1.7 billion, provides an exemption when fuel is moved either through a sale or transfer between distributors. The tax is collected when the fuel is supplied to retailers. The purpose of the tax exemption between distributors is to avoid cascading, where taxes are built into the price at multiple stages of the process. The second largest tax expenditure in this category is a grouping of 5 policies exempting fuel for farming, industrial fabrication, agricultural production or fishing industry, heating, aviation, and diesel fuel sold exclusively for use in portable power systems. Together, these tax expenditures are estimated to be $491.6 million. The third largest tax expenditure in this category relates to fuel transferred or exported out of state. The associated fiscal impact is $168.3 million. This exemption clarifies that sales and transfers of fuel out of Connecticut and sales in Connecticut to licensed motor fuels exporters are exempt from the tax. Lastly, tax expenditures across all other tax types are approximately $207.1 million in total. Tax credits comprise roughly 8.2% or $824.6 million of the total amount of state tax expenditures in this report. The property tax credit and earned income tax credit make up approximately 95% of the $356.1 million total against the personal income tax in that blue wedge on the pie chart. The film production tax credit is the single largest in the corporation and insurance taxes category. The FY24 estimate for the film production credit is approximately $100 million, which is roughly 30% of the $326 million total in this category. Tax credits for fixed capital, research and development, research and experimental, and insurance reinvestment are equal to approximately $126 million in total, or which represents about 39% of the orange slice here. Within the other tax types category, the most significant incentive relates to historic structures, preservation, and rehabilitation, which is an estimated $20 million against the Public Service Companies tax. Other major credits within this category are more technical and relate to the sale of oil or fuel. The total amount of these credits is $105.7 million. Lastly, please note that our sister nonpartisan Office of Legislative Research publishes a guide to Connecticut's business tax credits, which has detail on the rules for each of these credits. It's a handy reference and only 20 pages long. Here's a summary of the approximate $5.4 billion in sales tax expenditures broken out by types of purchases. As you can see here, consumer purchases make up roughly 40.7% of the total. Business exemptions are equal to 8%. Exemptions for purchase services is 20.5%. Purchases by government and nonprofits is equal to approximately 26.9%. And miscellaneous purchases equals 3.9%. This chart provides a categorical summary of how the 5.4 billion in sales tax expenditures occur. These tax expenditures are almost exclusively exemptions, meaning that certain transactions are excluded from the sales and use tax. Starting from the top and largest tax expenditures, sales to governmental organizations. Approximately 1.3 billion falls into this category. The rationale is conformity either to federal law or the general policy of taxation adopted by the state, which means that the state has decided not to tax itself or its political subdivisions. Prescription medications. Next is the single tax expenditure for prescription medicines, which also covers syringes and needles, and is estimated to be approximately $600 million. The rationale for this tax expenditure is perceived equity. Motor vehicle fuel is right below that. We have it has one tax expenditure for the motor vehicle fuel, which is estimated to be approximately $600 million. And the rationale for this tax expenditure is redundancy. As we discussed earlier, the excise tax applies to motor fuels in lieu of the sales tax. Food products, the single tax expenditure for food products of various sorts, excluding meals, is estimated to be $584.8 million. The rationale for this tax expenditure is perceived equity. The single tax expenditure for computer and data processing is estimated to be $480.3 million. The rationale for the tax expenditure primarily is to prevent cascading, but also provides an incentive. Patient care services. The single tax expenditure for patient care services is estimated to be $460.3 million. The indicated rationale is expediency, but redundancy also applies relative to the hospital fee. Certain utility sales, with an estimate of $230.2 million. This tax expenditure covers several different types of utilities and multiple rationales, including redundancy, avoiding cascading, incentive, and perceived equity. Page 44 of the actual report has more information if you need it. Within the other miscellaneous category, major tax expenditures include an exemption for motor vehicles or vessels purchased but not registered in this state by a person who is not a resident of the state, which is estimated at $124.7 million. The next largest exemption is the trade-in of motor vehicles, snowmobiles, vessels, or farm tractors, certain construction equipment, which is estimated at $87.6 million. The rationale for both policies is incentive. In the other consumer goods category, the largest tax expenditure is for items purchased with federal SNAP benefits, which is estimated at $70.5 million. And the rationale is conformity with federal law. Several tax expenditures related to personal health and hygiene are estimated to be $72 million in total. These include the following: non-prescription drugs at $31 million, personal medical supplies and equipment, including such things as oxygen, blood plasma, apnea monitors, chairlifts at $22.9 million, test strips and tablets, lancets, and glucose monitoring equipment for diabetics, $5.2 million, feminine hygiene products, $7.1 million, disposable or reusable diapers, $4 million, disposable pads for incontinence, $1.5 million, and breastfeeding supplies estimated at $300,000. The rationale for these several expenditures is perceived equity. The next largest tax expenditure in this category is for the purchase of solar energy, geothermal, and ice storage systems, which is estimated at $23.1 million. The associated rationale is equity. The major pieces in the other business category include the following: an exemption for sales of fuel that is used for heating purposes, gas and electricity in any location used for agricultural production or an industrial manufacturing plant, which is estimated at $77.5 million and is intended to reduce cascading. Exemptions for aviation and marine fuel, which is estimated to be $38.2 million in total. The rationales are incentive and redundancy. as it relates to marine fuel. An exemption for the purchase of material, equipment, tools, fuel, and machinery used by a fuel cell manufacturing facility with an estimate of 13.6 million. The purpose of this exemption is to provide an incentive. The next largest exemption in this category, which is estimated at 10.6 million, includes sales of and the storage, use, or other consumption of tangible personal property by a farmer engaged in agricultural production as a trade or business. Purpose of this exemption is to avoid cascading. We only have 4 more of these to go. The other services category includes the following. The largest expenditure in this category is for the renovation and repair of residential property, which is estimated at 68.5 million. This single tax expenditure covers the sales of renovation and repair services of paving of any sort, painting or staining, wallpapering, roofing, siding, and exterior sheet metal work other than industrial, commercial, or income producing real property. The rationale is expediency. The next largest tax expenditure in this category covers the development of media, advertising, and cooperative direct mail advertising, estimated at 25.5 million. Media advertising includes the sale of time or space in or on a pre-existing medium for broadcast or dissemination to all or a segment of the public. The rationale for this expenditure is to reduce cascading. The tax expenditure for calibration services and international organizations of standards, ISO, services is estimated to be 19.2 million. The rationales for our expediency and incentive. Still within this category, we have the tax expenditure for massage therapists and electrology services, which is estimated at 19.1 million and covers services rendered by licensed massage therapists and electrologists. The rationale is perceived equity. Lastly, in this category, environmental consulting services, which is estimated at 9.3 million, covers business analysis, management consulting, and public relations services specifically related to environmental consulting. The rationale is incentive. The last 3 categories on this chart by size are as follows. Sales to nonprofit organizations, combined lease, labor, and goods estimated at 155.1 million total, and is an incentive. Manufacturing parts, which covers the sales of and the storage, use, or other consumption of machinery used directly in a manufacturing production process, estimated to be 137.9 million. The purpose of which is to avoid cascading. An exemption for aircraft repair parts, services, and materials, tools for an aircraft manufacturing facility, which we estimate to be 108.8 million and provides an incentive. Onto the property tax. In this slide, we see total property tax exemptions. The total statewide reduction to local grand lists due to non-taxed properties is approximately 73 billion. Together, property owned by the federal government, municipalities, private colleges, hospitals, and sanatoriums, and religious organizations is equal to 48.8 billion, or 67% of the total. The total statewide reduction to local grand lists due to partial exemptions for individual property owners is approximately 14 billion. The largest single exemption in this category is for manufacturing and biotech, machinery and equipment at approximately 5.4 billion. Pages 194 through 196 provide a more detailed table of these exemptions at the local level. That concludes the presentation. We hope this overview has been helpful. Thank you for your time. And on this slide, you will find a link to the report itself and to our office. Are there any questions?
Thank you very much for that. I think, I'm sure there are plenty of questions, but I think what we will do is have DRS do their presentation first, and then we will mix in the questions between both of you afterwards, although I'm sure that will take up a chunk of your time. Thank you. We now welcome the Department of Revenue Services. we recognize there's no maximally convenient way to do the Q&A session, whether it's after both presentations or between them, but thank you for your patience and for staying with us. Mr. Commissioner, welcome. And the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's great to be here and thank all of you for all of your hard work each and every day on behalf of the taxpayers of the state of Connecticut. Today, DRS has a short 32 slide deck. Should be very exciting for you. But all sincerity, we've got about 6 or 7 pages for you just to kind of give you a 50,000-foot view of our most recent tax incident study. Just to give you some background on how we got here. This study has been done periodically throughout the years. We made a commitment, this committee and myself and our team here, to speed up, if you will, to provide more studies, to be able to start developing a longitudinal look in terms of decision-making that you, the policymakers, along with the governor, make in terms of the state of Connecticut and the impact of taxes. Just for those who don't know, when we talk about tax incidents, I always try to frame it and think about it in terms of the impact upon the individual taxpayer walking out around there right now in the state of Connecticut, the working families, those individuals that really support our great state. And what does it mean when we change or move or design new or implement new taxes or take away taxes? And what happens to the overall picture? So quickly, looking at the background of this, the authorizing legislation was in the Connecticut General Statutes 12-7C. 2014, DRS engaged Chainbridge Software LLC as a consultant developing a tax incidence model that focused on data from the 2011 tax year. 2022, we picked up the baton again and we engaged Accenture LLP to prepare a tax incidence study focused on data from the 2019 tax year. And we were here last year and we discussed a lot about what the findings of that report were. Through discussions with this committee, as well as some legislation that was passed, we agreed to go on a new schedule of designing and developing these tax studies. And there were new parameters for the study that were incorporated through legislation. And I just want to let you know that, because sometimes when you look at some of the big movements and movements within these numbers, you have to understand that there are new taxes that were carved in that we did not study during 2014. Doesn't make either study any different. It just means that there's more taxes that we were looking at in the study, and that's true for this one as well. 2023, as I mentioned, we engaged Accenture again. We also work closely with our RAF. We'll talk about that a little bit if you like, to prepare another tax incident study focused on the available data from 2011 to 2020, with 2020 being really the anchor year for the report that's in front of you. And future reports, we'll do it on a 2-year basis. The biennial tax sensitivity study will be produced. I mentioned something called the RF. We call that the Research, Analytics, and Forecasting Unit of DRS. We are pretty much hired up. I think we've got one last employee. It's been a challenge hiring folks in this environment, but we're ready to go. And I know Mike Gallagher is here, and he heads that particular unit that does all kinds of interesting things within our department in terms of data and analysis. I want to also emphasize that the data that we have in here is the data that was available. There are things that all of us would like to see in it, but we just don't collect that data. We don't have it. We may not have the statutory authority to get it, or it just may not fit our model. So that's why if there are things that are, quote, missing, it would be that we simply just don't have access to that data. A tax incident study, the report differentiates between 2 things. One is the economic incidents, entities that ultimately bear the tax that you all manage, cut or increase, depending on the will of the legislature and obviously in the governor's budget. And those on whom the tax is initially imposed, right? So you roll out a tax, maybe it goes to a business. Now the business looks at that tax over the long term and says, are we just going to pay this? Or are we going to be able to pass this along to our consumers? So it's an interesting way of looking at it. And then we want to look at what's that impact on the consumers when all these taxes have been accounted for. Tax incidence does not depend on where the revenue is collected, but on always who ultimately bears the burden for who pays it is something I think that all of us, all of you as policymakers will want to know. When done consistently, these reports can provide a view to stakeholders, the policymakers, on how people in the state of Connecticut experience tax policies, what their opinion is of them, and certainly thoughts that they may even have about providing a tax environment that we all can be supportive of. Again, as I mentioned, the current report is based on available data, and future iterations will encompass enhanced data capture efforts. Now, I will want to just say to you that we can't ask for data that's outside of our role as tax collection people. If it's the will of this body and ultimately the General Assembly to collect even more data, we may ask you to put it in a piece of legislation so that we can point to the legislative authority for us at DRS to collect it. So some of you may say, well, just put it on your form. We may not be able to do that if it's not involved with the actual duty of collecting taxes. Okay, key findings. Not much has changed since the last one, although this is a more comprehensive study because, again, we did incorporate more years and more data. But you'll see that our property tax continues to be the most regressive tax. Did I skip a page here? No, I did not, right? Okay. Seems to be the most regressive tax. That hasn't changed. It's something that we all struggled there. When I was in the legislature, we struggled with it in terms of what the impact is on our taxpayers, right? I think I was with Representative Horn last week, and I used the example of I have a good friend. She's a retired elementary school teacher. She retired in 1988. Her pension is about $18,000 a year. I help her with her books. That's all she does. That's all she has. It's the only income she has. She does have a home and she has property. Every time the property tax goes up, it really impacts her. It impacts her ability to keep her lights on, to keep her heat. She's got to make some challenging choices in terms of being able to stay in her home. So definitely, I think all of us understand that, but that's what makes it so regressive. Doesn't account for a person's income. You'll also see our income tax as 33% of the total tax pie of Connecticut. Sales and use, as you heard in the last report, is a significant area of revenue, as well as pass-through entity tax, corporate business tax, and various excise taxes that we collect. All other taxes roughly around $100 million or 5.1%. Okay, so economic incidence. How in the statistical world do they determine what is the incidence of a particular tax? -1 is viewed as really bad, right? That's completely regressive, hits everybody, and probably hits those with lesser income harder. +1 is a perfectly progressive tax. Now, I have not been in this job at 3 years, a long time, but I've been doing public policy for 30 years. I've never seen a perfectly regressive tax. Love to see one. Nothing's perfect, right? But there are scales and determining about the regressivity or progressivity of a tax. And 0 is a perfectly proportional tax. It's a balance of both. Comprehensive economic incidence for TY 2020, income decile view is also a view that we use, and a population decile view as well, not decimal, decile, excuse me. And you'll see our chart here will show some of the various taxes, their regressivity, their progressivity, et cetera, depending on where they are. This is my favorite decile view chart because it really kind of gives you a great snapshot of what's happening in Connecticut. The property tax shaded in light green is regressive and has a much greater impact on lower income deciles. Personal income tax shaded in blue is progressive and is proportionate to income levels. Sales tax shaded in purple is regressive as lower income deciles realize a larger incidence when compared to higher income deciles. But you can see that the property tax skewers our tax system beyond really anything that we've been able to control here because of the way our tax system is set up. Okay, we flip to the next page. Now, if we take out the property tax, you'll see that a drastic change takes place when you remove the property tax. Tax types illustrated by this graph include only those administered at the state level, and the graphic below becomes somewhat flat, which indicates that taxes administered at the state level have a more, I guess, linear distribution was what we would call it. Interesting to see the impact that has. Not to say we don't have work to do here. I'm not suggesting that. Future iterations. What do you want to do with this report in the future? And again, we've talked to committee chairs and ranking members about this a little bit. Certainly, the RAF unit will take over full construct of this study going forward. And we're ready to do that now that our team is on board, so we won't be using an outside agency. We also like to do things like outreach to interagency subject matter experts to incorporate additional data sources and modifications to methodologies. We want to do further examination of demographics associated with tax incidents. So it's going to require us to access and analyze additional third-party data. So we do that now, and we know Accenture did that, but we're going to do that ourselves. Consumer expenditure numbers, American Community Survey, stuff like that. We're going to update the analysis with the most recent tax years, and the report will incorporate more of an economic analysis rather than a statistical analysis for the General Assembly and the Governor's Office. So that's sort of the high-level presentation. I think I did that in record time. Sorry, I talk fast. But certainly happy to answer any questions, concerns, thoughts, ideas that you might have. And I have John Biella with us, our Deputy Commissioner, as well as Lou Bakari, our Chief Legal Counsel. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And I am a fast talker as well. So I appreciate that. And I know there's lots of information beneath this. We've just been discussed because these two reports before us obviously have overlap from a policy perspective, but they're distinct in terms of who's answering them. And I know there's no perfect way to do this, but I thought I'm going to encourage people to perhaps ask their questions directed at OFA first. And then we will move to DRS. I know there's overlap and that's not perfect, but rather than to keep you all from jumping back and forth between the chairs in the front, because we do need you talking into the microphones. Why don't we, if we could start with OFA, and I can talk while we're doing that, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your patience. Oh, there you go. Maybe, yes, there, that's a good idea. It's just about access to the microphone. So I think those microphones work perfectly well.
I guess. You know, well, he's gonna be, okay. Sorry. I don't want you.
Okay, so I will kick us off. And I want to focus some questions on the rationales that we apply to the tax expenditures. And it strikes me at looking at the rationales that, you know, particularly with respect to incentive or expediency, it seems to me implied within that is a time frame. And we don't typically set a time frame. We do these things and they last forever. Is there, and I know I'm tumbling over my question because I don't want to ask you a policy question, but a descriptive question. Are there observations about some of these tax expenditures that we have attached a time frame to that are that we can learn from and perhaps use more efficiently rather than just creating a lot of churn of information? Do we ever, I mean, it seems to me very rare that we set timeframes on these things.
Thank you for that question. There are different resources for you as policymakers. And I would just point out that the Department of Economic and Community Development provides within their annual report an analysis of tax credits that are here. I think that's just in terms of understanding how those credits are being used relative to the policies, the goal of the policies. I think that's probably the best resource for you.
Yes, thank you. I think I will say for myself that I think we ought to make better use of setting a time frame. I think we have a tendency here to sort of set up expenditures and then they take on an inertia and they never go away. And hence we are left with a very complex tax code, which I think makes it very hard on taxpayers. And on that front, I had a question, I think, which is probably for Evelyn. Just that as an academic exercise, if we were to, and I am not suggesting we should, but if we were to basically eliminate, sales tax exemptions, what would that do? If we were trying to keep the revenue number reasonably stable, how much could we reduce our sales tax rate if we were, able to cut those, flatten it out?
Good afternoon. It's a bit of an analysis because some of these items cannot be taken off the books, so to speak. And when you get down to the nitty gritty details, you can lower the rate. It's a policy decision based on your look and what you feel is best for the tax code, but certainly there are options there. I think the total for sales tax was 5.4 billion in total. Taking out government organizations, which is about 2 billion or so, which you could not do. That brings you down to 3.4. And again, that's ignoring each individual item, any overlap that it may be may need more consideration in that analysis.
So just overall, and I know this is why I say this is an academic exercise because there are very different kinds of exemptions in here. But those exemptions make up approximately what percentage of the overall, I mean, if we have a tax, sales tax rate of 6%, how much of that is occupied by the exemptions? Is there a way to put a number on that? I don't mean in terms of dollars. I'm trying to put it in the context and I know maybe I'm asking too much of the academic exercise here, but I'm just, trying to get a sense for everyone to think about when we have tried, and I note that Governor Lamont did try quite hard early on in his tenure to try to reduce the sales tax expenditures in order to bring down the rate. What these numbers do to our required rate for sales tax. It's an impossible question. You can say that.
If I can, Representative, I believe I know where you're headed. So if sort of we weed out the more technical exemptions
Yes.
and leave everything else, are you asking what the sales tax rate could be if all those non-technical sales tax exemptions were repealed? Is that your question?
Yes, basically. Thank you.
Ignoring all the technical issues, it could go down a few percentage points. But again, you would have to do a deep dive to see what would work. And what
I
wouldn't.
recognize we're putting a lot of very dissimilar things in one big bucket, and that's perhaps impossible. So with that, I will first questions for OFA. Go for it.
We're keeping track of all you all. Just a question. Hi, everyone, for OFA. Just looking at the summary page that you all provided us. Thank you very much for the tax expenditure estimates. Could you all clarify, I think, really the differences between FY24 and FY25? I think often as policymakers, we might look at these numbers and think to ourselves, wow, $10 billion is a lot of money that we're forgoing. You certainly recognized a range of reasons we do that, but I think it's important for us to understand what goes into that differentiation between the fiscal years. And if you could illuminate us to that, if that was policy related and what those were. Thank you.
There may be a handful of policies that are coming online that impact the second fiscal year, but the vast majority of that difference is explained by our projections and assumptions regarding growth in the underlying tax base.
Thank you. So in reference to the policy pieces, could you all follow up with us directly on what those are today or subsequent to the hearing about what is contributing there? Because I think to Representative Horn's point, I think we want to be mindful about what's going online and how we're making sense of those, given all of the other elements that are a part of the tax expenditures so far. So thank you so much for that.
We can follow up with that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. I'm going to change the policy again, given that we've found seating arrangements that won't require you to jump up and down constantly. And I think there are a lot of overlapping questions that I'm gathering here. So we'll just, we'll put everyone in the same queue for questions. With that, so Vice Chair Farrar, you will get a second bite at the apple. So if you wish that. Representative Cheeseman.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
And you may have answered this, Michael, when you sent me information before. In terms of the number of tax credits we have that sunset, can I conclude from this report that all the credits within are those that have no drop dead date? Is that correct?
Thank you for that question. What was sent previously, sent a little information.
Yeah.
One figure is from the DRS annual report, and that relates to stranded tax credits that expire or there's not enough liability to use. And that's a $3 billion estimate. It was their latest estimate of that amount. Our tax expenditure estimates basically work on past experience and to some extent their actual information, but they relate to the credits that have been used.
So the credits that have actually been taken up as opposed to those that are basically floating out in the atmosphere that are on the books, as it were, but were never used.
Yes, the figures in our report are those that have been used or estimated to be used.
So you said we have approximately $3 billion in effect stranded tax credits that we, as I said, carry on the books, can't appropriate against them because those are potentially revenue we're not going to receive. Is that correct?
I might turn this over to DRS, but it's my
You're all
understanding,
right.
once they are stranded, I don't know if they are on the books, so to speak, anymore, but I would let DRS kind of.
We would pass the baton.
Yes, if I may.
They're still out there. They're stranded and very, very lonely. Just waiting to be taken advantage of. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yes.
So if they're stranded and could be taken up,
Thanks, Representative. I think the term stranded simply means that the taxpayer doesn't have a liability
Okay.
to use them. So they're there, they're out there. If the taxpayer's situation may change, taxpayer could avail themselves of those credits. So, so when it's asked that, are they out there? Certainly they are out there and could be utilized if the taxpayer's financial condition warrants or allows a credit to be used.
okay. I suppose my question is, as long as they are stranded, when we are putting a budget together, one has to take those into account as a possible revenue loss, correct?
I would say yes.
And we cannot appropriate against them. So there's $3 billion out there. Which seems to me a good argument for having end dates. And I'm sure we'll get a lot of pushback on them. All right, and I will be respectful because as I say, I know other people have questions. Do you want me to come back to me? I have one more or? Okay, one more quick one, tax incidence study. Yes, I know. Don't encourage me. Looking at the suits index and regressivity, it appears the corporation tax, by looking at the suits index, is by definition the most regressive tax. So how would we benefit the residents of Connecticut by getting rid of the corporation tax? And is this an argument for getting rid of the corporation tax surcharge, which I know is temporary to be proposed? I'd just like your comment on that. I know it's a small, what, 825 million? But that suits number doesn't lie.
No, it doesn't. I think your analysis is spot on. I think there is benefits, obviously, to anytime you lower, particularly the corporate tax in terms of recruitment for businesses and being able to present Connecticut as a good place to do business in. So there's definitely economic benefits to that. I'd also point out too, in the report, there's a line about business taxes in general are regressive to the taxpayers. For those of you that run or operate or have been involved in a business, you know that once the state assesses a new tax, within several years, that tax completely shifts over to the consumer in a variety of different forms. It's only natural to do that because, and of course, you tell your customers, it's not my fault, it's the state of Connecticut. So it's an interesting line that this report does delineate that business taxes do end up at the doorstep of our taxpayers.
Thank you, Representative Cheeseman. Next we have, I believe, Senator Martin.
Thank you.
Okay, Mike, regarding cascading, out of the $10 billion that's reported here, how much is contributable to the cascading and perhaps even the redundancy?
Thank you, Senator. That's a very good question, and I don't have that data in front of me, but we can certainly get that to you as a follow-up.
Okay, thank you. And I guess I'll go to the Commissioner. Want to have a better understanding on your slide. It's not numbered here, but the income decile view, in particular, the property tax component of that. The first, I can't hardly read this, but it looks like the first decile, right? They have a greater proportion of the property tax specifically. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that is correct. Although on decile one, we do in the report, just throw up a cautionary warning on that decile only because corporate business folks that show a loss are embedded in there, as well as people who don't report income or don't have income, or people who don't have income to report on their filing. So just
Right.
be a little bit careful with that.
So I'm just curious, what type of property do they own? That for them to have such a large,
Automobiles,
pardon me,
automobiles.
is that, how much of that is contributable
I don't know if I have
contributable
the,
to that?
I don't know if we have the exact number on the gun.
Yeah, Senator, we don't have the exact number on, property. That's one of the problems with this, that's embedded into this report is we can't tie property tax to a specific taxpayer. So the methodology is an even distribution. So in other words, if the state collects, and I don't know the number, I'm just going to throw this out there, $3 billion in property taxes on motor vehicles, that $3 billion is distributed across each of the deciles. So it's the methodology that's within the report. So you're correct. Those are some of the things to think about, is that somebody in that first decile may not necessarily have a home or a vehicle that's of significant value. So you have to take that into consideration. And as Commissioner said, decile one, the income is reduced in decile one because of things like losses. So you could have a taxpayer that is operating a business that has an operating loss or a net operating loss from that business. That brings the income level down in that decile. So it's a little
So if I'm clear, it sounds like you're basing this on population, on how many people are in that decile. So you took all the personal property taxes, and you divided it by the number of population in each of the deciles. That doesn't seem to be very accurate.
Like I said, there are some assumptions that are built in here. Yes, you have to be aware of that. Correct.
Okay. I probably have another question, but
Thank you, Senator Martin. You'll have another opportunity. Next up, we have Representative Meskers, followed by Representative Paletta.
Madam Chair, okay, probably heading towards Commissioner Boughton more. Is that okay in terms of
Yes,
questioning?
we're mixed. We're taking all questions now, Representative Meskers.
Okay, perfect. So, Commissioner Boughton, thank you for your testimony. Questions of regressivity on taxation. The scope of your report is based on income tax, sales tax, property tax. You haven't included any analysis of ancillary fees that the government levies, right? I'm thinking in terms of both, say, the utility bill and other bills where there are activity fees in terms of an analysis. The income tax is progressive, as it should be. Any of the fees and activity, particularly if you look at the electric bill, those are pretty regressive. Are we looking at a comprehensive, or is it just related to tax policy versus fees and assessments?
I would agree with you, Representative Mesker. We don't, we go with what we're statutorily charged with. And so we weren't charged with doing analysis of the impact of fees. whether occupational licensing fees or other fees that are charged throughout state government. I will say you're at a subject area that's near and dear to my heart. I'm very proud that our governor put forth the proposal to, in a very modest way, to reduce some fees, but it's a start. And it's there's other proposals that are floating around the legislature in this year's budget. So certainly that's something that's I think does have an impact overall on people's perception of the state of Connecticut. But that's not within the charge of our analysis.
Okay, thank you very much. That's it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative Paletta, followed by Senator Fazio.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and good afternoon. Good afternoon. My question is for Commissioner Boughton. First of all, I want to thank you both for coming. It's always very educationally every couple of years to hear from you. And I'm probably partial to the deputy commissioner because he lives in the best district in Connecticut, but I'll just leave that there. But I think you both are doing a great job. So my question is it kind of evolves around the income tax. Secretary Beckham was here, I believe it was last month, and we spoke, he spoke at length about the out of state or the workers that work maybe remote, that work for some sort of, organization company that's out of state. They still use our infrastructure. Many of them have kids in the school system. And I think the governor himself has said that he wants to see, more taxpayers as opposed to more taxes. What are we doing to, and I know there was I believe he mentioned a court case, or he was looking into trying to capture this revenue, but what are we doing to capture the revenue of the folks that are working? They live in Connecticut, they use our resources, but perhaps they're working remote, or they're one day a week in New York City or Boston. And we're not seeing that reflection and that revenue in the state income tax.
I'll start this, Representative, and pitch it to your constituent as well, because he wants to decide, you get the election coming up. But anyways, having said all that, I would say the convenience of the employer test, which is what you're referring to, has been something we've discussed for at least since pandemic and post-pandemic era, because we really saw it come into light. New York has been extremely aggressive at going after our residents and saying, you owe us, even though you live in Connecticut, you work in New York, i.e. therefore we want your money. We do have a reciprocal convenience of the employer test for New York as well. The problem is that the trade-off is not, we lose money in that exchange when we do the trade-off there. Their governor has proposed in his recent budget address the possibility of getting some Vanguard folks to and we'll give them a break on their income tax to go out and to file a claim and pursue litigation against the state of New York. That'll take a long time, like a decade. It's going to take forever. However, you got to start somewhere, and I applaud him for his effort here in doing that. Having said that, we routinely come into those kinds of discussions during our audit period. Sometimes they take the form of domicile cases. Sometimes they take the form of the convenience of the employer test that we apply to them. We are rigorous in our approach to it, but it's just when you're, and I always get this screwed up a little bit, but if you're, a teacher in Danbury and you're working in White Plains, it's different than if you're a hedge fund analyst and living in Greenwich and working in New York. In other words, we're losing money on that exchange, even though we may collect from that teacher in Danbury. So, and we do provide a credit for folks who pay in New York. New York isn't always so kind on the other side. But with that, I do want to just defer to Lou Beccari just to flesh that out just a little bit in terms of what some of the strategies we've been using. But it's frustrating for us. Thankfully, Massachusetts is no longer a convenience and employer state. They are a physically present state. And we've always internally said we should go back to being a physically present state, which is what we were in 2019. But Counselor?
Representative, if there's anything we can elaborate on, but I think one of the things I heard in your question, I think is really, really sort of important to give some context, is if you are a Connecticut resident in the circumstances you describe, and you do work, say, for a New York employer, but you work from home in Connecticut for some percentage of a week, right? That's the type of scenario we're talking about. I think it's critically important to understand is that resident is required to report by law all of the income that he or she earned. So whether it was from the time he or she was physically present in New York, or the time she was working at her home. So all of that is reported to Connecticut. And that's where you get into what the commissioner talked about. And this is a matter truly of policy for this committee and this body. Historically, and up until I think it was 2019, there was a situation where that individual who we're describing in your example would be taxed on that income that she earned in Connecticut and New York by New York, as well as the income earned in Connecticut by Connecticut. So there was a situation where, and I hate using this term because people sort of give it a bad connotation, this dreaded double taxation, right? Everyone needs to know double taxation is not illegal or unconstitutional. You certainly can be taxed on income in multiple jurisdictions. I know I'm oversimplifying it, but this body made a decision to provide essentially a credit to that individual you described for the taxes that individual paid to New York on the income while working at home in Connecticut. Is that right, wrong, or indifferent? That's where I sort of am on it, but that's the structure we find ourselves in. So I thought that sort of context is important to understand and can make a value judgment, a decision as to what Connecticut thinks is the best for its. I certainly understand the policy is saying that we've given Fairfield County residents, which is the primary place where we deal with that commuter issue you're describing, because of the double taxation issue, but certainly could understand policy arguments on the other side. But there were long discussions in my last piece on this about what the state of Connecticut could do with regard to this issue, because it really stems from New York being a bully. They're a big bully on the block with their convenience of the employer test, and they are New York, and their test has been upheld through their state courts up to their highest courts. And I know you might be aware of Professor Zelensky, who's a New Haven resident, who's a professor at Cardozo Law in New York, and I won't get into it. He has challenged that law in the early 2000s. He is challenging that law again currently in New York, and maybe the U.S. Supreme Court might take it up. I don't know if I'd hold my breath on that one, because I'm not sure the court really cares about a dispute between Connecticut and New York, much like it didn't with Massachusetts and New Hampshire, as the commissioner referenced during the pandemic. I hope that provided some context.
Thank you. A lot of context. And, I'll just end by saying, I think a couple of years ago in the legislature, we passed a bill that had to do with out-of-state license plates. Of course, it's not with this committee, but the genesis of the bill was, to go after those folks that are using their resources and not paying. For those of us that live here and spend, 95% of the year here in Connecticut, sometimes, we feel slighted, because if someone's making great money, and that's awesome. But if you're making great money and you're not paying, then who's left to pick up the pieces? Maybe the rest of us. So just something to think about. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative. Senator Fazio, followed by Representative Carney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to follow on, before I get to questions about the report, a couple of them. I wanted to follow on Representative Paletta's very, I think, important question. I did see the administration's plan on trying to incentivize and encourage residents who are kind of unfairly treated, especially by New York's tax structure, to pursue litigation. I wanted to ask, maybe DRS, maybe the commissioner has some insight. Why not have the state itself, with all its resources and expertise, take a stab at litigation, given that we are an offended party? We're probably, not only are we losing hundreds of millions of revenue potentially in those scenarios where, a resident of Stamford who works in New York but works from home on Fridays is still getting taxed in New York. Why not have Connecticut be a party to that sort of lawsuit, given you'd think that they would have standing, given that we as a state are losing revenue? Was there any thought process, and why lead with the individuals rather than the state?
Senator, we've had multiple conversations. I've had multiple conversations with the governor related to this issue, who's very passionate about it as well. And frankly, I think everybody's on the same page here in terms of the issue at hand. I'm in the minority here, and I want to just preface this by saying I am not a lawyer, which means I think I know everything about the law and I know nothing. So, but my experience has been we would have a tough time proving standing. That's always been my concern. There are other opinions though out there by other folks that say we may have standing. The only way to get this out of the New York system is to appeal to
Yeah.
to federal court and to work our way to try to get to the Supreme Court. I just have concerns of standing for us. I think it's a better case if you have an aggrieved taxpayer or taxpayers that can say, hey, I've lost a lot of money here. And I think New York has been just a bully here and it's just unfair what they're doing. I think that tells a better story. Hence the governor's initiative in his budget address. Having said all that, we have had discussions about doing that. We just thought this might be a better direction to go in. But look, we're open and take advice from anybody on this one. It is frustrating for us, and Representative Paletta's comments are on point in many ways.
Yeah, I appreciate that answer, and I too am neither a doctor nor a lawyer, but here we are. And I did put in a letter at the beginning of a bill letter, whatever you want to call it, at the beginning of the term because I thought it would give Connecticut a better case for standing on this topic, that we are entitled, or it's taxable income whenever someone's working in Connecticut or something along those lines. I forget the exact verbiage. But it was I did speak with lawyers on it, and it was intended to give Connecticut standing. So happy to have further conversations with anyone about that. But I do appreciate you guys are making the same effort on this. Good for our residents and good for our state. Again, and I appreciate the reports from both DRS and OFA. You all do a very good job on these studies every other year, and I find them very valuable. I know other legislators do too in decision making. Tax incidence progressivity is a very important consideration when we design taxes, and it certainly was when we did our tax cut last year. Mr. Commissioner, this probably is a best oriented question for you, but how do you think about, obviously you statutorily you have responsibility to deliver a study on tax incidence and progressivity, but how do you think about growth as well? Because obviously if I'm a taxpayer, maybe I make average or below average income, I'd like to see the tax structure oriented or tax changes so that maybe I have a little bit more after tax income, but I'd really be best off if I had higher levels of compounding growth. Because if my growth rate of income was increased by 1% a year compared to what it otherwise would be, I'd be 11% richer in 10 years and 22 or 23% richer in 20 years. So, we don't want to just think about things in the static environment, but also in the dynamic environment. So how do you guys think about within the administration growth as well, and upward mobility as well, in addition to progressivity?
Well, I'm assuming you're meaning growth towards individual's income, correct?
Yes.
Right. So a couple thoughts come to mind. One is that this body, with the leadership of our governor, chose to reduce the income tax, the largest income tax reduction in the history of the state. And I applaud each and every one of you for having that vision to do that for a variety of reasons. Yes, it's not showing up in this data because remember this data is 2020, but I think it will show up eventually. But more importantly, you're setting the stage, you're sending the message to people that want to come to Connecticut, stay in Connecticut, live in Connecticut, businesses that want to do that look, you understand, and there's certainly a wall that you hit in terms of taxes, fees, and so forth. So when you talk about somebody's individual income growth, I think you have to look at that through the lens of, are we trying to create more taxpayers, or are we trying to create more taxes? I like the latter. I like to create, maybe the former. I don't know, I get this mixed up. But I want more taxpayers, just like you do. And so for us to do that, we've got to look at our tax scheme. That doesn't mean it doesn't have to be progressive. It can. It doesn't mean we can't take into account the challenges that many of our folks and decile 1, 2, and 3 are facing. But it does mean that we have to be very careful in terms of how we look at individual growth of income and whether we decide to tax that delta that person has grown. I will say an area that might be ripe for discussion, not this year, but certainly in the next biennium or as the governor and this body think about it, is the exemptions, which I don't think have been raised since 2007. Right, John?
The personal exemptions for personal income tax, some of them have been the same since 1991 when it was enacted.
That's the individual 15,000 and
single filers are 15. That's been changed over the years, but it has been a long time since the single filers have changed. Head of households remained at 19,000, I believe, and joint filers, it has remained at 24,000 since 1991.
So I think there's some opportunity there in terms of, and I think in the future studies, you're going to see that we're not moving to progressivity because we haven't changed the exemption. There might be something for further discussion in out years. But anyways, I know that didn't quite answer your question. I guess I would say, Senator, that let's be judicious and cautious in our approach as we want to create more taxpayers.
Yeah, and I think that attitude and refrain is exactly the right one. And I think that's also why the kind of the approach to cutting taxes in the past year was a wise one, because it was oriented both towards growth and towards progressivity. It was basically a progressive income tax cut. And I think almost all the economic evidence across the discipline suggests that income taxes, personal or business, but obviously personal income taxes are the biggest chunk of our revenue, are the biggest headwind towards income growth, personal income growth, and economic growth in the long run, which is really the key towards upward mobility and alleviating poverty and improving people's outcomes. So, that's why I think the direction of the tax cut last year was the right one. It really focused on middle class and working class income tax cuts. And I also think your point, and to the OFA report, in the future, looking at the tax exemptions and deductions, which are very complicated and numerous, and some of them are justified, but a lot of them accrue to certain industries over others. Looking at those, removing those in order to deliver even bigger middle class income tax cuts, or changing the brackets or increasing the exemption, will also be progressive and will also be pro-growth for the long run benefit of our state. So I think there's a lot in these reports, and there's a lot not in these reports, that should inspire, I think, positive reforms that are along similar lines of what we started to do in the past year, and will help our economy in the long run. So thanks, everyone, for your work and your time, and thanks, Madam Chair, for your indulgence.
Thank you, Senator. Next, we have Representative Carney, followed by Representative Farrar.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you to OFA and DRS for your presentations. It's certainly very informative. So one of the things I like to try to look at is basically, how are the taxes people are paying benefiting them? So what they're paying for, how is it coming back to benefit them? And one of the things that struck me, and I know this is probably something more for the municipalities, maybe CCM or cost, is that property tax, the regressiveness of the property tax, which is something that, we've talked about for a long time. And I guess I'm just wondering, has DRS ever looked at, I guess, two different things? One, fully funding pilot, which would still leave municipalities at a loss, because pilot doesn't necessarily cover 100% of certain properties. And the other, I guess, what if some of these property tax exemptions were either reduced or eliminated based, going forward? Just for example, I had a bill today about going forward, making it so a private university, when they purchase a taxable property, that they would have to pay that property tax going forward. They acted like, hell had frozen over and they're going to, Fairfield University is going to shut down, which is a little absurd. So, I look at it like, okay, so we're giving this property tax exemption to this university. So that money's got to be made up somewhere. So what benefit are those folks who are giving the university that exemption? What are they seeing? So that's something, I guess, that I'd like to explore. But I guess back to the original question, have you looked at what fully funding pilot would look like, or, reducing or eliminating certain property tax exemptions?
As a general rule of thumb, we don't do runs like that where we would look at pilot or anything like that. But putting my ex-mayor hat on, if I can for a minute, I would say to you that the default out has always been to fully fund pilot, right? That's always, that's been talked about since I was here with Senator Fanfara in 1998. And we have made some broad steps at filling, at funding pilot, but it's never been fully funded. The challenge for that is that not every city and town in Connecticut would benefit equally. And so what happens is, not that you're picking winners and losers, but naturally there'll be delegations that say, hey, this change, we're not getting anything out of it. Others will say this is great because 50% of our community is owned by a nonprofit or a church or some agency that doesn't pay taxes. I actually proposed that bill, only I said, if you are a nonprofit and you acquire a house or a building, that you would be on the hook for the property taxes that it used to pay when you hit a certain trigger within the community. Didn't go very far, but as a mayor, I saw that happen a lot, right? And so slowly, as you have creep of very good, well-meaning, hardworking agencies that are doing a ton of good in the community or in the state, but maybe not necessarily for the community, you lose, there's another building going offline. There's another set of, so it hurt, and it would hurt our grand list in particular. But I would tell you that, again, with my mayor's hat on, the opportunity for you all here is to have a very broad, big discussion about property taxes, the tax setup here in the state of Connecticut. Don't do it in one task force for 3 months. Take a year, take 2 years, bring in some experts and really look at how we can develop a system that's as fair as all as we can be, but also narrows down the over-reliance on the property tax to fund core services, because we don't have counties. In many states, counties pick up the cost of schools, public safety, fires, things like that. Here we have 160 odd cities and towns that are trying to do that. It's not sustainable. So there's value in having that big, broad discussion.
Okay, I appreciate that. And I do have a question about the sales tax as well. And this is something that, I've always, really wanted to explore. And I don't know if you could, it takes some looking into, but I've always thought that, good things, and I put in a bill, I'll just give you an example about gym memberships. Gym memberships, you're going to go get healthy. I've proposed year after year after year, it never goes anywhere, to eliminate the sales tax on that. Why? Because going to the gym is a positive thing, and it could save money in the long run. So taking that as an example, I mean, have you ever looked at what we're actually charging the sales tax on, and, sort of weighing the benefits and negatives on the state? So, I know that fast food is taxed as a good example because of the nature of fast food, but going to the gym is also taxed. So I don't know if you've ever looked at anything like that before.
We do internally, we work with OFA sometimes determining, we'll get questions about, how much money do we generate from fast food establishments and sales tax revenue. Obviously cannabis is a lot of interest in that right now. Those numbers we generate all the time for folks. So we do, it's interesting policy, in terms of the health club scenario that you present. I think we have, and the governor has proposed in the past, broadening the sales tax and lowering it. I actually think that's a good way to go. I wrote a study that said we should do that probably 7 or 8 years ago now. I know the challenge for you politically, though, is that, now you're going to be charged tax on aspirin, and, people lose their minds. And like you see the flyer coming already, right, with a bottle of Bayer and your picture all mean on it. So it's you can't do this on the one-offs. I used to do politics, right, Senator Martin? So you can't do this on the one-off. That's why I really think a strategic, large, incorporate that in a larger, broader study that you can pull, not just 1 or 2, but an entire new scheme in terms of how we collect taxes here in Connecticut. And then you can get some of those things done. Makes all the sense in the world, by the way, to trade off fast food with going to a health club. I see where you're going with it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you for answering my questions.
Thank you, Representative. Next, I believe we have Representative Farrar, followed by Representative Cheeseman.
Thank you to the chair. Hi, everyone. I will come back to DRS now. Thanks you all for being here with us today. I appreciated Commissioner Boughton, kind of what you said at the outset about why we produce the tax incidence report. Having said that, as someone who's newer to the legislature, I've been through two of these, and I think what is so critical about them is they really make clear to our constituents what their day-to-day looks like in our state. And unfortunately, the incidence report tells us once again that our working and middle-class families are paying 3 to 5 times the effective tax rate of the wealthiest. And I think your graph, which was great, around the tax year 2020 economic incidence in millions, really charts this out. And I kind of had a couple questions there, because you show here certainly that the personal income tax has shown itself as being slightly more progressive than these other areas of our tax system. And you also noted that we did make some historic changes to our income tax structure. And our hope is that we can even do more to push more towards this more progressive income tax. But I was wondering if you could speak to this piece that's at the bottom of the graph, this other taxes greater than 100 million that is perfectly, kind of more deeply regressive, and what's included in that, and how that fits into our overall tax incidence.
Yeah, so that column would be motor fuel, excise taxes, the estate and gift tax, which generates roughly 200 million, I think, for the any given year. So that's kind of a lump in category for all those various taxes.
Okay, super. Because I think more than anything, what's important about this report is drawing our attention to each of those and what we can do to make each of those potentially more progressive. I did also want to ask, in reference to your thoughtful kind of full transparency at the front of the report, mentioning that there was a certain amount of data that wasn't available. And I did want to note, I know in last year's session, we worked collaboratively to pass new language and statute that would strengthen this report. And I know that some of that was included, and there was a number of items that were not included in this report that were referenced in that statute. And I wanted to ask, given that you said that the future for this report really is in-house, which I'm excited about with the new team on staff, how can we make sure that not only the statute is followed through on for the next report, but how could we even make sure that we could have access to potentially some of the data that isn't here before the next report is due?
So you did give us some new direction last year, and we appreciate that. We are in the process of printing those forms right now. Some of that we're collecting new information we're collecting during this filing that people are currently paying their taxes now up till April 15th and beyond, depending on where you're living. So I feel confident that we'll be able to meet all of those things. I would say this, the estate and gift tax was cited as not being in the report. Understand that impacts about 200 independent tax or individual tax filers in the state of Connecticut. It is probably the most progressive tax we have because it only impacts about 200 filers. But again, as we look at what's the incidence on the working men and women across Connecticut, not a lot of folks are subject to this because they don't own a $13.5 million estate that they're trying to give away. So, but it does generate $200 million a year, roughly. So I would say that we certainly can incorporate that in, but we would have to distribute it across all the deciles. Might skewer the report a little bit for you, or we can break it out and do a separate report. We've talked about that with the team at OPM as well. So, but the other ones we're just going to need to collect. For example, there was a request in there. There was an issue in there related to married, single, child, young adult. That kind of data is something we typically don't collect, but we certainly could. We collect, joint or single, but we don't necessarily know what the status of that relationship is. So those are things that we're looking at now, and we're developing the forms as we speak.
Thank you. And just one quick follow-up to be clear, because I know in the statute we had specified making sure that DRS had the resources to fulfill this report. And so hearing from you, Commissioner, it seems you do have the resources to fulfill everything that is in the statute currently. Is that true?
We do, thanks to Rep. Ferrari and some other people
Yes.
that were advocates for us. It took us, as I mentioned earlier, a while to fill out the RAF team, only because the labor market is so tight out there, but we're pretty proud that we're ready to roll with that particular department within our agency. In addition to that, when we needed to bring in a consultant, the money has been there, thanks to the team at OPM for being so supportive and helping us pull this together as well. So we have everything we need to give you the information that you need going forward to make the decisions that you may or may not make.
Thank you. I look forward to updates from you all as you figure out those next steps so that we can, as you said, have the best information in front of us in order to really fix this upside down tax code that our residents deal with every day. So thank you to you all for being here and for those questions, and back to Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative. Next, Representative Cheeseman, followed by Representative Meskers, I guess both for the second. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the second time. A first question for DRS, and it's a follow-on from Representative Farrar's question and relating to what Senator Martin asked before. In terms of being more specific about the property tax burden on each decile, is there information that you could get from the towns that would allow you to better attribute that tax burden to each decile?
That information, a lot of it goes to OPM. Being a former mayor, we used to race and file our grand list forms, and I think we certainly could get back to you on more detailed data we would like to get. But we have a good system of filing that at OPM. Then, we work every day back and forth together,
Right.
sharing information. So I think that as we go through this process, we'll look a little closer. We may come back with some thoughts that we can include with that once a year filing that each municipality does to make some value judgments. And I may be going on too much here, but we were doing some research on second homes, for example. And what we found is that us to determine if you own 2 homes in Connecticut, I had to go to each assessor's office across the state of Connecticut to find this out. There's no central area that we keep that information. And that would be helpful to know, again, as you're making decisions here in the General Assembly.
Well, and I think, this whole exercise raises many questions about just our process of data collection in Connecticut. Are we collecting the data we need? And once we have that data, what are we doing with it? Because I think very often we collect large amounts of data and compile very useful reports, which then sit on shelves. We talk about, lowering the rate of sales tax and expanding its breadth. And I know mentioned the governor had proposed that, but I recall the 2018 Fiscal Stability and Economic Competitiveness Report, and one of their 20 recommendations was just that. Okay, so that's my question for DRS. Thank you. I have a question for OFA. In your slide number 9, your breakdown of tax credits in millions of dollars under the corporation and insurance taxes. If I recall correctly, you said about 100 million of that was the film production tax credit. Of that 100 million, how much is actually attributed to actual film production as opposed to the sale of tax credits to other entities? And if you can't tell me today, I'm happy to wait for that information.
Representative, we will get back to you on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, for indulging me for the second time.
Thank you, Representative Cheeseman. Representative Meskers, followed by Representative Berry.
I'd follow up on the comment from Representative Cheeseman related to the film tax credit. I don't know if OFA has any information. It would be worthwhile between yourselves or DECD to see whether the film tax credits across other jurisdictions, other states, are in production or in facilities. My concern in a film tax credit for an economic activity is whether or not it builds a business, as to what versus film tax credit for sound stages and studios builds a physical structure that basically makes a sticky economic activity. My concern in tax credits is that they generate repetitive activity in the state. You know, we've in the biotech, we're doing wet labs and dry labs. There's the nature of economic credits that give a persistence to the benefit to the state. So I'd like to hear back in the future on that. And on the tax incident report, I don't know if it's beyond the scope, Commissioner Bauman, but I'd like to know, when you talk about regressivity and progressivity, I think there's two parts to that, right? One is tax collection and one is fiscal expenditures, and maybe that the coordination with OFA. Because when I think of certain jurisdictions such as my own, there's very little in the way of educational cost sharing funding, very little in the way of benefits on. So structurally, between our contributions to the state, what we receive in the status quo, and I'm not sitting here having a major argument about that. It's a fairly progressive situation already. So I hope we're looking at those incidents and looking at the overall both tax incidents in the raising of revenue and in the expenditure revenue, because I think we are probably in a very progressive state.
Thank you, Representative Meskers. Representative Berry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is corporation taxes. How do we compare to other states?
I'm going to pitch that one over to our deputy commissioner, but benchmarking against other states is critical, and it is one of the charges of the revenue analytics forecasting unit is to benchmark all of our taxes against other states.
Thank you, Representative. Up until recently, 2016, we were quite different than our neighbors in the Northeast. Much of our counterparts in other states filed using a unitary combined filing method. In other words, a consolidated method. So if there were various entities within a group, you can combine all of them and report and pay taxes on a combined method. Connecticut, up until 2016, was always a separate filing state. And that, quite honestly, in our experience, opened the door for abuse between related company transactions. So our audit team at the department regularly dealt with this issue and tried to combat the abuse that was taking place with related company transactions. In 2016, the General Assembly changed the separate filing regime and went to a combined unitary filing, which really closed that I'll call it a loophole. There were some other good things that the General Assembly did with respect to corporation business tax. It went to a single sales factor apportionment, which means basically that a company apportions their income based on where they're directing their business activity. So you can have an out-of-state company, a company in California that has sales into Connecticut. That California company now has to apportion some of its income to Connecticut and pay tax on that. So that change, in my opinion, was a big change and really benefited companies that are located in the state, because the former regime for apportionment took into account payroll, property, and sales. So there was a three-factor formula. So those companies that had property and sale and employees here apportion more of their income to the state. So this really did make a shift to out-of-state companies that are doing business in Connecticut. So I hope that answers it. A couple of really big issues, but I'm sure there are more. I don't know if Lou has anything else to add, but in my opinion, those are the good things that occurred with the corporation business tax in comparison to some of our neighbors.
And how about like the corporation surcharge? Is that common in other states?
I wouldn't say it's common. I'd say it's probably something that's more on the unique side than common. Other states, corporation business tax is a difficult animal, so to speak. A lot of states treat things differently. There are states that have taxes on profits, for example, or just gross revenue. We have what's called a franchise business tax. So, and the surtax just happens to be part of that.
And how about the pass-through entity tax? Is that handled differently in Connecticut?
Not anymore. There was a big change in the last session that shifted the mandatory nature of our pass-through entity tax and made it elective, which is in line with every other state that has a pass-through entity tax. We were kind of out there on an island when it comes to pass-through entity tax, and in that ours was mandatory. And we were the first in the nation to enact a pass-through entity tax. And again, it was beneficial to taxpayers or to members of limited liability companies or pass-through entities in order to reap the full benefits that were, I'll say, taken away from the Tax Cuts and Job Acts that limited the state and local tax deduction federally. So last year, the General Assembly made the tax mandatory, elective, took away that mandatory label. So we're in line now with every other state that enacts or imposes one.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. I had a couple follow-up questions about that, the analytics unit, the RAF unit. We have spoken today a lot about, what the additional reporting requirements that they will, we've specified a lot more information in future reports and about the ability of that unit to handle that. But I believe when we proposed this unit, we also did assume that they would be significantly revenue generating in future years. And I wonder whether that is still your assessment of that unit.
Yeah, there are other things to do besides do a tax incident study. I'm not being snarky, but this takes up time, no question about that. But what their job, really they're charged to do, is to be forward thinking and forward looking in terms of their forecasting. So when Representative Barry asked a question about corporate taxes, we're able to say not only this is what we do, not only this is what current states are doing, this is where we think this particular area of taxation and tax policy is going, so that we're going to be a little bit farther ahead down the line for our strategic partners within state government, obviously OPM, the governor's office, and of course the legislature and this committee, so that you can start weighing the cost benefit of whatever decisions you may need to make. And then we know that there are profound changes going on within the marketplace. There are alternative fuel vehicles that are, whether it's electric, hydrogen, whatever that will look like in the next 10 to 15 years. That's going to have an impact on our gas tax scheme that we have here in Connecticut and how we fund and build our roads. So you're going to need to know what's best practice out there, what's working in some states, what's not working, why isn't it working when you have to make those difficult decisions. And this unit will do that. There's also, through our analysis of data coming out of our auditing department, for example, these folks will be able to share with us a little bit about not only in-state where they're seeing areas of leakage, but also, again, what are other states doing? What areas do they find leakage going on? For example, we know sales and use tax is a difficult tax for us to collect, particularly with small businesses. It's complicated on one end for them. On the other end, there's folks that just don't pay it. We know there's a cash underground economy that goes on with many of our landscapers and many of our housekeepers and folks like that. Well, how do we make it easier for them to pay? And what are other states doing about that leakage that's going on in our system? So they'll be able to help us with that, and that will provide a revenue lift for you all here. We've done studies. Once this is really rolling, fully staffed, couple of years of experience under these folks, I don't want to put a number on it, but it very well could be in the tens of millions of dollars if we do it right. So I'm excited about it. It's been slow. That's really a reflection of the marketplace in terms of hiring right now, but we finally have got a team together that we're really happy with.
So you feel that unit is fully staffed right now and ready to go? I mean, they're at the beginning of the process. But...
Yeah, I think we've got one position, maybe two, we're either in the process of interviewing and doing the final hiring on. could come back and ask for a position or two more via the budget process if I think we need it, if the team thinks we need it. But I think we're in good shape.
And just to follow up on what you were, the sort of tax gap analysis, which was definitely part of our revenue projections for the unit. And I just wanted to make sure that, there are, to speak broadly, when you look at the tax gap, there are those who are intentionally trying to not pay taxes in Connecticut and avoiding, actively avoiding tax. And there are others who are just making mistakes because we've made our system so complex. And so I want to make sure I'm hearing that unit is focused on both of those issues about ways to make the process simpler for the taxpayer so that we can also pick up those.
Yeah, I think I was telling the chairs about a story. So we've created within DRS a unit, if you will, of roughly 20 auditors that are focusing on cash-based businesses. Sounds good, right? So it's what we should be doing. Well, the problem is I can't go into my favorite restaurant anymore because they fell within our auditing line. So I get yelled at when I walk in the door. So now I'm going to the McDonald's down the street, which I know is bad for me. But anyways, point being that there are impacts when we go out and we try to close this tax gap, right? We know where the leakage is. So the first step in enforcement isn't to go in there, drop the hammer, shut them down, put chains on their doors. We don't do that. We will work with them so that they understand our system and how to file in an appropriate manner. And after that, if they continue to not do it, then we have to take enforcement steps. But our first step is always to sit down with the business owner, explain how the process works, even prepare some demonstration documents, sample documents about how you do this. Give them names of who they can call if they're confused, because a lot of folks don't have bookkeepers. They don't have the accountants that are working with them. And we try to get them current and get them to comply. Payment plans are usually the rule of the day for folks and try to get them up to speed. And then if they persist, as we circle back to them in a year or two, and we always do, and then we'll know whether or not that they've learned what we've taught them and will continue to honor their commitment to the state. So I just want to be clear about that. So it is a two-pronged approach, 100%, but it's painful. And as elected officials, you should be aware that you could get calls and understand where we're coming from. We'll first try to work with your constituent and not try to lock them up or lock the doors in their business.
Thank you. And I look glad that we have, you've done a lot of work to staff up that unit. I think it will be really helpful to us both in terms of generating data so that we can do good policy, but also, help close that gap. So Senator Fonfara.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon. I appreciate the presentations by both organizations. Commissioner, I will say I always enjoy listening to you and your candor. I think it's, in your case in particular, it's the axiom is true that you can take the man out of the legislature, but can't take the legislature out of the man. With respect to the point that's been said here a number of times, the governor's refrain of having more taxes than taxpayers, which I agree with. But the question is that what doesn't follow and should is, all right, how do we achieve that? And in my mind, there's two ways. One is to grow incomes so that more people, as your income grows, if our tax structure stays as it is, stands the reason that fewer people would be in that regressive category, or at least their tax payments would make them less regressive. The second is, and by the way, I'll say with respect to growing incomes, that means investing in people in our state, education, in higher ed, in a host of other areas that would result in a more productive person. And how does that get defined? It means that in the eyes of the employer, they're worth more and they're going to hopefully be compensated more. And so you can't have one without the other. You can't disinvest in those things that would make a more productive taxpayer to achieve a less regressive, at least fewer people in the regressive categories. And the other is to, as we grow revenue, and I think you were alluding to this somewhat with regards to the with respect to the property tax, but I would say this is the case, should be the case with respect to other taxes as well, sales tax in particular. I believe with AI and others, we could now, when you go and buy something, if Senator Martin and I go and buy a flat screen TV at Best Buy this evening, it's blind to his income and mine. We pay the same, even if our incomes are dramatically different. We probably have the technology today. We don't have it available to us, but probably the technology exists for us when we put our card into the machine that can measure our income. Whether we ever go there or not is another story. The point is that making our tax structure less regressive, and by the way, folks in that first decile, the poorest of us, they rent. If you think they're not paying property taxes, you're crazy. No property owner is eating the property tax. It's in the rent. But again, in terms of how do we get to more taxpayers, I should say more taxpayers, less taxes, but or taxpayers. It's if we're intentional about, as revenue grows, and changing those things that are most regressive. If the sales tax is always going to be part of our system and we're not going to identify income in that process, then we ought to reduce our reliance on it. If we're going to have a property, we're probably never going to eliminate the property tax, but we could reduce our reliance on it, as you said earlier. That's pretty hard in this building. Most people say we're in the land of steady habits. I like to say we're in the land of bad habits. And those are some of them, that there's just such inertia, such resistance. We'll have reports like this that point out how regressive our tax structure is, but put a proposal together that would begin to move in another direction. I have one again this session, you know it, that would share income tax, sales tax, and corporate income tax revenue with municipalities. We'll see the appetite of that as we move along in this session. But we can't lament the fact that the world is a certain way. We as lawmakers have the ability to change that. You certainly, and where you sit, can help us. When I was listening to the discussion with my co-chair about I believe it was tax credits and the report, as Mr. Murphy indicated that there's a report by DECD on that. I wonder, does OFA or OLR analyze that report? Does DRS look at the tax credits and whether they're effective or not? And we're a part-time institution and we do our best, but we could use all the help possible to develop better policy. That's a long question with no question mark at the end. If you care to respond, but otherwise, thank you.
No, the only thing I would say is, and I applauded you earlier for taking that first step, reducing the income tax, even in those middle brackets. I know it's not a lot of money, but it's a lot of message for people out there, and that's critical. And so, good job. And I applaud the governor for raising this and running with it. The other thing you did, I think it gets a lot of credit, and I think everybody in this room can agree upon, is the EITC increases. It's earned. The earned income tax credit is earned. You have to work to benefit from that credit. So in terms of progressivity, it's a great tool, to help. And the increase is not included in this report, but it will be eventually. In terms of, it's a great tool to help because you're requiring people, and people want to work, and they're now able to take advantage of it once they go out and help the economy. You've just created another taxpayer. So, their first steps have been taken. The second step is what you alluded to, which is how do we design a system that is fair, relatively progressive to the point that you can be, helps our cities and towns, doesn't bury them, doesn't bury the state with the needed services that they need. And I think that's going to take a long time and a lot of thought to do. I'm an optimist. I think with the right report, with the right work and the right folks on board and the right enough time spent on this over a period of 18 months, you could have something that everybody, to the most part, there's always somebody who's not going to be for something, but could be certainly supportive of. What you can't do though is have something where people cherry pick and they want to do this and they don't want to do that, because then Senator, that brings in the law of unintended consequences. And one thing done here hits something down the line that nobody ever thought about, and we're all scrambling trying to fix it. So I'm always optimistic. I think that you've taken a tremendous amount of effort in getting to this point, and I understand the inertia in this building just like you do, but I actually feel pretty good about where the state is in the positioning that all of us collectively put it. For what it's worth.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you all for both being with us today and also for the tremendous work that went into the reports and for asking a lot of follow-up questions both today and I'm sure more to come. A quick reminder that any, information that was requested by individual committee members today, if you could please make sure to share that with Bree and Ash so it can be distributed to the whole committee, that would be most helpful. And with that, I believe our next we do expect to have our first public hearing in finance on March 6th. We hope to post that and make it official soon. And with that, any other final comments before we adjourn?
Thank you for finishing on time.
2:58, how about that? Thank you all.